Thank you for joining me. I'm Gord Long. A reminder before we begin, do not trade from any of these slides. They're commentary for educational and discussion purposes only. Always consult a professional financial advisor before making any investment decisions. Today, I want to discuss changes underway in our financial system that are resulting in major monetary and fiscal policy mistakes. The most egregious abuses of economics that we see today start with an accounting identity, a true statement or equation, but often end with absurd economic claims that the uninformed swallow as gospel, while politicians and the powerful capitalize on it. In this session, I want to focus on one such example, that being the gross domestic product, or simply the GDP formula. The formula is the foundation of national income accounting, and it's true by construction. However, the fact is that nothing in this equation tells us how the economy actually works, and therefore it is often misused. Because government expenditures enter positively into the GDP, it is believed by many that by increasing government spending, it raises GDP. Simple, right? Not so fast. Uncle Sam's spending doesn't increase the size of the economic pie. It just redistributes existing slices to Uncle Sam or to whomever Uncle Sam finances. More public sector consumption means less private sector consumption. Today, though by government spending $2.50 more, it will only boost GDP by $1. The real question, however, is where did the $1 come from? And at what cost? And with what consequences? That I want to talk about also. Whether public or private, the fact is that fiscal or deficit spending doesn't cause real economic growth. Consumption is downstream from production. Growth is about increasing the supply of goods over time. You can spend if the goods haven't been produced. Production grows as technology and production processes improve. Such improvements require savings and investing rather than consuming. All the refinancing in the world won't boost productivity if it isn't channeled correctly. More efficient producers, not partisan spending, create flourishing economies. Though the current administration's Bidenomics approach consumes plenty, it will only produce disappointment, as most manipulative flim-flam plans do. This isn't an opinion, it's hard reality. And to show you that, this is what I want to take you through in the outline shown here. Let's start with discussing the critical economic importance and often ignored differences between savings and credit. Savings is a central pillar of a viable capitalist system. Savings is generated by real corporate profits, real personal net wages, real government surpluses, and real net exports. By real, I stress after adjusting for inflation. It is savings that can be invested into productive assets. These are investments that create real wealth, remembering that wealth can only be created by building or producing something, mining it, or by growing it. Finance is not wealth, but claims on wealth. Financial assets are secured by collateral, which are the legal claims on the underpinning link to wealth. It is through savings and its investment in productive assets that we achieve a rising standard of living. A rising standard of living achieves getting more, and through competition, for less. The capitalist system of creative destruction delivers sustained economic vitality. Adam Smith's hidden hand keeps everything sort of working and in balance unless the process becomes impeded for some reason, often through government interference in some well-intended fashion. In reality, this is no longer how our system is operating. Today, we have increasingly reduced savings and become more reliant on credit. Dramatic levels of borrowing are now occurring in all facets of our economic system, whether by consumers, corporations, or governments. There is nothing wrong with borrowing. It is more about the degree and how it is being used. Today, credit is being used dominantly for consumption. Today, the GDP formula tells us that the U.S. is just under 70% a consumption economy, compared to China, which is in the mid-30s, and the EU countries in the mid-50s. Consumption doesn't create wealth. It actually destroys it. By taking investment away from being invested into productive assets and using it in things that are not productive. That is, return on that investment and discharges any debt associated with that investment. Credit and consumption also does something else. It encumbers collateral and increases dependence on increasing sources of unencumbered collateral. This chart is the easiest way to see the massive shift that has occurred since the U.S. came off the gold standard. The U.S. dollar became a fiat currency, and global balance of payments are made with credit through credit notes. Savings in blue have been replaced by credit creation in black. What is also telling in this chart is that since the 2008 financial credit crisis, credit creation is shrinking in relative size and being offset by foreign financing of the U.S. in red and an increasing reliance on Federal Reserve financing. We also see that since COVID, we see the acceleration in the Fed dependency as foreign investment falls off. The U.S. has become dominantly a service economy, and as a consequence, U.S. trade balance deficits have increased in size over time. The U.S. has become dependent on the need for foreign central banks to have their foreign reserve currencies be reinvested into the U.S. in the form of U.S. treasuries and U.S. dollars. And it is steadily trending in the wrong direction. As this chart illustrates, it worsens further with each recession. And excluding COVID, the U.S. hasn't had a real recession since 2008. A lot of pillars of U.S. capitalism and the maintenance to keep it going have eroded. The shift from capitalism to what can best be described as creditism is taking a serious toll. None of these are easily or quickly reversed. The U.S. is following what is an expected path when savings fall, are not invested in productive assets, and credit growth stalls because of shrinking unencumbered collateral and rising risk premiums, with consumption being forced to slow as economic stagnation and stagflation emerges. COVID was a massive shock to the global system. As I have written and talked about many times, the 40-year period of the Great Moderation has come to an end, and with it, we have a different economy on our hands that we are no longer accustomed to. The obvious problems and challenges ahead can be easily seen if we care to look. However, we're not looking at them through the right lenses. Our lenses are distorted and blurry. We can best illustrate the distortions by considering the GDP versus GDI formulas. A little later, we will then discuss the GDP formula on its own and how, as I mentioned earlier, the most egregious abuses of economics that we see today start with an accounting identity, a true statement or equation, but then often end with an absurd economic claim that the uninformed swallow as gospel. Gross domestic product and gross domestic income, or GDI, are two slightly different measures of a country's economic activity. In theory, GDI should equal GDP. That's what the economic theory is based on. GDP measures the value of what economies produce, such as goods, services, and technology. GDI measures what all participants in the economy takes in, such as wages, profits, and taxes. However, different data sources yield different results. The difference also varies over time, suggesting that the difference is made up of more than minor accounting differences. GDP tallies all spending by business consumers, overseas companies, and the government by conducting a wide-ranging survey of retailers, car dealers, manufacturers, and others. GDI estimates all income in the form of wages, salaries, corporate profits, interest, and dividends and rents. They're actual numbers coming right off balance sheets. Historically, during pre-computer times, GDP was available sooner, and therefore became the more used reference. Even today, it is still reported a month earlier than GDI. The median difference from Q1 2010 through Q4 2022 has been 0.09 percentage points difference. That's close enough for government work for saying real GDI and real GDP as separately calculated are the same. However, in the 4 quarters ending Q3 2023, the median difference has been negative 1.97 percentage points. That's the same size as the reported economic growth. Year-over-year growth rates comparisons show clearly in this increasing spread published by the Economic Cycles Research Institute. Here are the latest numbers which blow the socks off the difference. On the left is the GDI reported by the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the government's actual numbers. On the right is their GDP report published on a quarter-over-quarter comparison. Q3 2023 had GDI at 1.5%, GDP at 5.0%. Q2 2023 had GDI at 0.5% and GDP at 3%. Annual percentage changes showed 2022 GDI at 2.1% and GDP at 9.2%. 2021, 6.1 compared to 10.1%. These numbers are to match exactly with some slight difference based on data captured. What's going on here? What we have is an illusion of growth that's getting worse. On the left, we have what is happening with the GDP elements. On the right, we have what is happening with the GDI elements. One set of data components are basically rising while the other is falling or slowing. The common denominator is debt and how it is impacting either side directly or indirectly in each of the elements. When you pump an additional 5.9 to 7.5 trillion into the economy, it has a profound impact in various ways. When that amount of economic pumping must be borrowed and financed, it comes with another set of impacts. GDP and GDI is screaming this, but of course no one for some reason is talking about this. We do, however, need to be, because it tells us this explosion in debt is not sound growth. It is only growth as seen by the GDP formula that actually more or less represent debt as growth. More on that in a moment. Debt has been growing for years, yet the GDP formula still shows growth as slowing. What gives here? Let's now begin to talk about the actual illusion. We initially began arguing that the GDP growth formula was increasingly becoming an illusion a decade ago. And then in 2017, we finally published our annual thesis paper on exactly that subject. It is available for download on the Matasi.com website. Our focus then was the double accounting of debt as transfer payments by government to the public for consumption. Additionally, foreign investment to buy U.S. Treasury debt was double accounted in both the I and the G in the GDP formula. Effectively, debt was being counted within each of the I for investment, G for government, and C for consumption components of the GDP formula. Transfer payments and government debt were never part of the thinking when the formula was first formulated as a satisfactory approximation for economic growth. Likewise, the calculation of the deflator used in the formula for inflation, which we called into question. As we said then, and we are saying today, GDP isn't measuring wealth. It's measuring spending, production, which is sold. GDP counts the dollar value of our output, but not the actual improvements in our lives or even in our economic conditions. Example, if you dig holes and fill them, it is considered GDP. In fact, you could build a missile, blow up the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, and every house within 5 miles of it, and it shows up as GDP. The missile cost money, and the government paid for everything. Essentially, GDP is measuring the pace at which we're replacing private wealth with government waste. We're actually destroying wealth at the fastest rate since 2008. What has changed is that since we wrote our thesis paper, incremental debt is increasingly become less effective in flowing through the formula. What I mean by that is that it now takes $1.55 in budget deficit to generate only $1 of growth. It takes $2.50 in new debt to generate only $1 of GDP growth. Less and less of the debt is actually ending up as consumption. That is because more and more of it is gobbled up as interest payments by the recipients of the debt, whether consumers, government, or corporations. Federal government debt payments have surged to over $1 trillion per year and soon will be $1.5 to $2 trillion. This is on a $27 trillion economy. At $1.5 trillion, this is 5.5%. When GDP growth is decidedly lower than that, debt is growing faster than the economy. The GDP formula is not measuring economic growth, but some other abomination. As I mentioned earlier, mainstream economics talk as though GDP is identical to wealth. Even the Fed's own writings say, and I quote, "When assessing the amount of government debt held by the public, it is customary to measure it relative to GDP. GDP serves as a rough proxy for the economy's tax base. That is, its capacity to pay back the debt, i.e., default risk." End of quote. That's from government's own papers. That's close enough when it's private firms or individuals producing more to sell more. In that case, rising GDP means the economy is getting richer because more stuff is being produced. But it is actually the opposite when it's government spending, because the government's job is taking wealth and lighting it on fire. That means that when the GDP is growing from government spending, it's not measuring wealth, it's measuring dissipation of wealth at best, destruction of wealth at worst. So translating that brave and stunning GDP into the real world, we're destroying wealth at rates not seen since 2008. This actually lines up with what we've seen in job growth reporting. Job growth last year turns out to actually have been government and government-related social services job, more or less when you really consider real jobs. In some states, it was literally more than all the jobs created. In other words, the private sector is shrinking. All these government jobs, of course, are unproductive. They're consumption. As important as they are and contribute to our abilities to prosper, they're not directly dollar for dollar making us more prosperous as a society. This is another reason why the amount of new debt to create new growth is increasing. On a national basis, it is exploding. The Bureau of Economic Analysis job report is another statistical distortion at work. This one, I believe, intentional versus being created by a formula derived and premised on government debt being restricted by sound money and non-fiat currency. Private sector jobs are falling while government directly related jobs are growing. This does not include government contractors from defense, increasingly almost all areas in the U.S. economy, employing people based on government funding. It is now quickly accelerating. Remember, these people and contractors spend money on consumption, which pushes up GDP. It all has an eerie feeling, like how the former Soviet Union and CCP-controlled China managed centralized planning to increase economic growth. How'd that work out for the USSR? And time will tell for China. What we are increasingly witnessing is the taking of wealth from productive access and squandering it on government spending. Governments have never been successful in increasing productivity. That has been the hallmark of U.S. innovation by the private sector. It seems government's job is to create regulations. Regulations often only get in the way and actually impede productivity. Example, a recent study by the National Association of Manufacturers estimated that federal regulations cost large manufacturers with at least 100 employees an average of $24,800 per worker annually. That's roughly half the salary of the typical blue-collar employee. In other words, these onerous regulations increase the cost of hiring American workers by 50%. Wonder why jobs left? It's even worse for small business, which is the backbone of the American economy, where they have less than 50 employees, which is the vast majority of them. Regulations now cost a staggering $50,100 per work annually. In this case, employers' labor cost is now roughly doubled. This cost is based on compliance reporting and the details that's required, and of course, the actual regulation itself. Though real growth has increasingly become an illusion measured by GDP, we have still been able to muddle through the last decade. Frankly, it has actually been growth from China that has saved the developed economies from their serious realities. On 4 separate occasions, it has been China that has saved the global economy from the realities of its illusion of real growth as debt exploded and central bank balance sheets likewise exploded in size. However, now China, with an economy built on capital formation, is starting to feel its own economic pain of unsound principles of finance and public policy. Central banks around the world are well aware of what I just discussed. It's the root of why so many of them have started buying gold. Their shift in rate of accumulation suggests they see something quite troubling. Gold is, in many ways, an archaic relic, but they know it is the only sure thing that can be assured to be accepted as collateral in troubled times. Unlike paper claims, it is not based on someone else's debt. In troubled times, this is the only thing that really matters. You should now be able to see why the world is now pricing U.S. debt as measured by the U.S. 30-year Treasury against U.S. credit default swaps. And those credit default swaps are steadily rising in cost. I said at the beginning that the U.S. and global financial system is changing. As fiscal policy moves towards increasing levels of what I always refer to as helicopter money, potentially flowing directly to consumers, velocity of money will begin to turn up, and with it a broader-based impact on price inflation. During the initial waves of price inflation during the 70s, the economy was fundamentally more capitalist. That is, more money was saved and reinvested into productive assets, labeled here in the GDP formula as I. Again, this has been steadily changing with advancing sequential waves of inflation and deflation. The I generated money for consumption C, while net exports were positive, adding more money to the economy. This resulted in consumers getting more for less, and standards of living continued to rise, even with price inflation. The developed economy's GDP formula was forced during COVID into a regime change of massive and unprecedented monetary and fiscal deficit spending for bailouts and economic stimulus. Monies flowing towards bailing out and the subsidization of failing zombie corporations, the destruction of small businesses unable to survive pandemic lockdowns, and industries such as transportation and hospitality were completely crippled during the COVID lockdowns. With inflation having increased prices such as food by over 18% since COVID, consumers are getting less and less for more and more, while standards of living have stagnated or falling as a result of policies and spending that are further increasing inequality to levels not seen since the Gilded Era. What this means is that government can be expected to become increasingly more dominant by debt financing spending. The consumers most likely will increasingly witness receiving what the government determines, awards, or rations. Standards of living will likely become increasingly universal, except, of course, for government officials and crony capitalists, from big tech to big pharma to mainstream media to the new billionaire class. If we're not extremely careful, World War II, Italy's Mussolini's marriage of government and corporations, which he then labeled fascism, may become an eventuality for many countries, including the U.S. Many believe that is already occurring and use different labels when talking more or less about the far left or the far right. This sort of economic philosophy never survives. Inevitably leads to currency debasement, economic stagnation, stagflation, and eventually hyperinflation. We touched on some of these unfolding trends in this year's thesis paper, The Emerging Regulatory State, which we encourage you to read. The problems I have been discussing here are not isolated to the U.S. It is a global problem impacting almost all fiat currency-based developed economies. What can we conclude? Debt finance creates paper claims for wealth. Wealth is the collateral. The claims are supported by collateral storages, third-party risk, rehypothecation, and derivatives. Debt is a distortion of real growth, now shown by increasing differences in GDP versus GDI. There's a derivative explosion in growth that's now reached a level of quadrillions in level, which is hiding the expansion and overlapping of these claims. The U.S. debt is now tracking to the credit default swaps. We have a risk of accelerating debasement of claims. We have increasing risk premiums in both bond duration premium and equity risk premiums. At least that part is still to come, I believe. And a shift to central control, like I've mentioned earlier, the former Soviet or CCP single polatory regulatory state. There are some positives, however, in the U.S. if we can urgently begin to address the real problems with real data. The U.S. has a massive spending problem that must be addressed with the realization that deficit spending is no longer creating growth, but actually destroying wealth and reducing unencumbered collateral. What can make major differences on the areas of productivity, that is, new technologies, advances such as artificial intelligence, could fuel a productivity-led boost to long-run economic growth. Safe haven asset events abroad could also increase the foreign demand for U.S. Treasury notes as a safe asset, helping to stave off projected increases in long-run U.S. interest rates, and a complete reevaluation of U.S. entitlement programs, Social Security, Medicare, disabilities, and a multitude of other social programs. I didn't say get rid of them. I said the whole thinking needs to be revamped in terms of qualifications and timing, etc. As I always remind you in these videos, remember, politicians and central banks will print the money to solve any and all problems until such time as no one will take the money or it is of no value. That day is still in the future. So take advantage of the opportunities as they currently exist. Investing is always easier when you know with relative certainty how the powers to be will react. Your chances of success go up dramatically. The powers to be are now effectively trapped by policies of fiat currencies, unsound money, political polarization, and a global policy paralysis. I would like to take a moment as a reminder, do not trade from any of these slides. They're for educational and discussion purposes only. As negative as these comments often are, there has actually seldom been a better time for investing. However, it requires careful analysis and not following what has traditionally been the true and tried approaches. Do your reading and make sure you have a knowledgeable and well-informed professional financial advisor. So until we talk again, may 2024 turn out to be an outstanding investment year for you and your family, and I sincerely thank you.